The evening light fell gently across the fields, gilding the stubble of harvested wheat in a colour too beautiful for what was coming. Villagers moved through the haze like fragments of a dream baskets on their shoulders, mud clinging to their boots, laughter echoing between cottages built from the same earth they tilled. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward, carrying the smell of bread and sweat, the fragrance of ordinary survival. In that hour before night, Europe seemed timeless, unshaken, and safe within the rhythm of bells and prayer. The sound of the church bell rolled across the valley, deep and steady. It marked the closing of the day and, unknowingly, the closing of an age. Mothers gathered children, men stacked tools, and from the inn came the faint hum of a song older than memory. Yet among the warmth and noise, a traveller coughed. No one looked up. A cough meant nothing. Autumn air could chill the lungs, and there were always coughs when seasons changed. But this one lingered wet, hollow, wrong. Far beyond these quiet hills, across seas and deserts, whispers moved faster than any wind. Merchants returning from foreign ports spoke of a fever that burned without mercy, of ships drifting into harbour with no living crew. They said it began in distant kingdoms the villagers could scarcely name, carried by invisible spirits or by wrath itself. Still, such stories belonged to other people, far from these familiar lanes. What disaster could cross oceans and mountains to find them here, hidden beneath 1,000 prayers? As dusk deepened, the rhythm of life continued. The market square emptied, dogs barked, and then fell silent. The first stars emerged through thin smoke, pale and trembling. In the manorial hall, candles flickered against walls hung with faded tapestries, scenes of battles long won, saints forever triumphant. The lord of the manor reclined beside the hearth, dismissing tales of sickness as superstition. Disease, he said, was for sinners, for the filthy and unwashed. Nobility, wrapped in divine favour, had nothing to fear. He believed it, and so did everyone who needed the comfort of hierarchy. In the village chapel, the priest rehearsed Sunday's sermon. He would remind them that God punished greed and impurity, that the world's suffering was proof of his justice. Yet even he paused when the candle flame quivered, though no breeze entered. Outside, an owl called an omen to some, a simple creature to others. The priest crossed himself and continued reading, unaware that faith and reason were about to be tested in ways neither scripture nor scholarship could explain. Down by the river, washerwomen spoke of travellers collapsing on the road. One claimed she had seen a man whose skin turned the colour of night, whose breath rattled like coins in a purse. Another laughed it away, saying fear made fools of everyone. Still, they washed faster, glancing at the woods as though the trees themselves listened. Silence grew heavy. Even the water seemed to slow. The sun disappeared, leaving behind a thin red horizon that looked less like twilight and more like warning. In distant ports, sailors loaded cargo under the same sunset bales of cloth, crates of grain, and tiny passengers hidden in the straw. Rats scurried through shadows, their fleas feeding on every heartbeat. The trade that connected kingdoms also bound them to a single fate, though none could see it yet. Gold coins exchanged hands, ships pushed away from docks, and the world's pulse quickened. Every creak of timber and splash of oar carried the future closer to these unsuspecting fields. By midnight, mist had risen over the village, swallowing fences and pathways. The bell rang once more later than usual, lower than before. Some claimed the metal itself sounded tired. Dogs whimpered. A child woke from a dream of black feathers falling across the moon. His mother soothed him with a lullaby, her voice trembling without knowing why. Far away, that same song might have been heard in another tongue, sung by another mother to another frightened child. Fear had already begun to travel faster than trade. In the manor kitchen, servants whispered about omens, comets, eclipses, and blood-red rain. They spoke softly, afraid the walls might repeat their words. Yet their fear was older than the rumours, a memory buried deep in every living thing that senses when nature shifts. The horses refused water. The hens would not roost. Even the air felt thicker, as though it carried secrets meant for no human ear. Still, the morning would come. It always did. The fields would glisten with dew, and men would return to their ploughs, believing the world unchanged. The sickness remained invisible, patient and silent, watching from the edges of maps and minds. For now, Europe slept beneath its golden veil, dreaming of safety while something ancient and merciless stirred just beyond the horizon. Soon, the bells would not mark the hour. The wind shifted southward, carrying with it the smell of salt, tar, and destiny. Along the coastlines, harbours buzzed with motion, sailors shouting, ropes coiling, gulls slicing the air. The great arteries of trade pulsed stronger than ever, and each caravan, each vessel, each pack of mules unknowingly carried a passenger none could see. Wealth moved like blood through the continent, and within that current hid the infection that would bleed it dry. Merchants spoke of fortune as though it were protection. They believed prosperity insulated them from fate, yet every coin exchanged in bustling ports sealed another village's doom. Silks from the east shimmered in market stalls, cinnamon perfumed the air, and below the wooden tables, the rats feasted. They climbed ropes slick with sea spray, invisible stowaways exploring the underbelly of civilization. People looked upward to the spires of churches, never downward to the scurrying shadows that would soon write history in fever and ash. The narrator lingers over a dock at dusk, ship lanterns swaying, the murmur of sailors telling tales of phantom winds. One swore that an entire crew had died mid-voyage, bodies locked in embrace as if frozen mid-prayer. Another claimed a caravan in the east vanished, leaving only carts of rotting figs. The rumours moved faster than evidence, and fear itself became another traded good. Yet curiosity thrived beside terror. Humankind could never resist the promise of elsewhere. Across muddy roads stretching toward Venice, Paris, and London, merchants trudged with carts piled high. Inns filled with travellers whose faces changed by morning. Behind laughter and bargaining, coughs echoed. Fleas leapt from fur to fabric to flesh. No one suspected the chain of contagion forming in plain sight. The storyteller's tone remains calm, almost tender, as though describing a slow-moving storm, beautiful in its symmetry, cruel in its silence. Inside monasteries that copied holy texts, scribes recorded strange accounts arriving with the mail. Letters from distant abbots spoke of black marks and death without decay. The ink blurred where tears fell. Still, the monks prayed louder, their voices rising like waves against the inevitable. Faith was both comfort and blindfold. Even as messengers collapsed at the gate, the bells called for vespers, as if ritual could halt the tide. In one scene, a child watches his father load a wagon. He asks why travellers cover their mouths with cloth. The father smiles faintly and tells him it is for the dust. That answer will linger when the boy grows old enough to remember the year the dust bit back. The narrator allows the silence to stretch, inviting the audience to feel the slowness of catastrophe, its refusal to announce itself. Markets flourished even as graves multiplied. No one connected the two. Profit, after all, made the world logical, and logic is humanity's favourite disguise for denial. When a ship arrived with fewer crew than it departed, officials recorded it as misfortune, not warning. When port dogs refused food, men laughed and called them spoiled. And when the first rat died trembling on the dock, someone swept it into the sea, never imagining the ocean would return the favour in waves of plague. As winter approached, the roads thickened with mud, slowing the caravans. But the disease did not slow. It rode in breath, in touch, in faith itself, passed from pilgrim to pilgrim seeking blessing. Candles burned in chapels where infection bloomed, and relics kissed in devotion became tokens of death. Still, hope persisted, fragile as frost. Humanity has always mistaken motion for safety, and so Europe moved faster, unaware that each mile drew it closer to stillness. The chapter's heartbeat quickens toward the close. Ships vanish into fog, ports fall silent, and messengers stop returning. The unseen has arrived. The continent stands at the edge of recognition, poised between commerce and calamity. The story's voice lowers like candlelight in a draught, promising the next revelation, the night when bells will no longer summon prayer, but morning rose beneath a pall of smoke. From rooftops, black threads of ash curled into the sky, drifting like ghostly banners. The sickness had a scent now, a blend of decay, sweat, and the strange sweetness of rot. Streets that once rang with cartwheels were hushed, except for the groan of wood as doors bolted shut. Every sound carried weight. A single cough could empty an alley. Europe, so proud, so crowded, had entered its season of silence. In the cities, denial met reality. Physicians in long robes stuffed with herbs walked like crows through the mist, muttering prayers behind beak-shaped masks. They prescribed air soaked in roses, gold coins held in the mouth, smoke blown through keyholes to chase away invisible demons. Some wrote treatises blaming planets, others blamed sin. None blamed the flea. The narrator's voice remained steady, neither cruel nor sympathetic, merely watchful, as though history itself were a tide unfolding. Within monasteries, candles burned without rest. Monks sang psalms until voices cracked, believing sound could guard the soul. Outside, wagons creaked under weight no prayer could lighten. The dead were collected at dawn, their faces covered in linen that soon matched their skin. In market squares, fires burned day and night, filling the air with the smell of loss. People carried herbs in pockets, crosses on strings, hope in gestures. Everything was both protection and surrender. Among the chaos, the narrator lingers on individual moments. The baker, who left bread cooling, though no one remained to eat it. The midwife, who stayed beside strangers, her hands trembling not from fear but exhaustion. The priest who refused to flee though the church doors stood open for escape. Humanity revealed itself not in strength, but in quiet defiance, the refusal to abandon meaning, even as meaning collapsed. Nobles fled to the countryside, dragging infection behind them. Their carriages rattled past peasants burying kin in shallow graves. From behind lace curtains, they prayed louder, believing volume equaled virtue. Yet death made no distinction. Within stone walls and straw huts alike, the same fever burned, the same darkness bloomed beneath the skin. Hierarchy dissolved as the plague reminded all flesh of its equality. Superstition multiplied faster than infection. Some whipped themselves in streets, begging forgiveness for sins they could not name. Others blamed strangers, outsiders, anyone different enough to absorb collective terror. In one city, rumor claimed the wells were poisoned. Crowds stormed through narrow lanes, torches in hand, seeking scapegoats. The narrator lets the scene unfold like a fever dream firelight. Screams, the tragic certainty that fear always hungers for a face. Yet, even in despair, small lights endured. A mother pressed lavender into her child's hand before closing the door. A monk brewed vinegar for washing wounds, not knowing he practiced the beginnings of hygiene. In one remote village, neighbors agreed to speak only through closed shutters, preserving distance long before quarantine had a name. Survival was rarely heroic. It was quiet, instinctive, almost accidental. At night, the bells rang constantly. Not for time, not for worship, but for counting. Their tolls replaced conversation. Each note meant another gone. People began to dream of silence to wake and hear only wind, believing for a moment that it was over. But dawn revealed more wagons, more graves, more priests too tired to weep. The omniscient voice observes with tenderness. Even horror grows dull when it lasts too long. Fatigue becomes mercy. The section deepens emotionally as the narrator describes the loss of seasons. Farmers could no longer tell spring from autumn, time blurred in smoke. The moon rose over abandoned fields where scarecrows outnumbered men. Wolves crept closer to town walls, howling not from hunger but confusion. Nature reclaimed rhythm while humanity forgot its own. It was as if the earth paused to breathe through the dying. Still, there were survivors scattered, fragile, learning through terror. Some discovered that burning clothes halted the spread. Others noticed that fresh air healed faster than prayer. Knowledge sprouted in desperation, each observation a seed for the centuries to come. The world was dying, yet also teaching, whispering that endurance often wears the mask of surrender. The narration softens toward the close. Smoke thins. A single bell remains, its sound distorted by distance. Within a ruined chapel, a boy kneels beside his mother's grave. He presses his palm to the cold stone and whispers a vow to remember. That vow, carried forward in countless hearts, will outlive the plague itself. From that promise of remembrance will rise curiosity, and from curiosity the first questions of a new age. The scene fades to grey light over empty streets. The last of the carts rolls away, leaving wheel tracks that the wind begins to erase. Above the city, crows circle lazily, black against a pale sky. The narrator's voice drifts like prayer and prophecy combined. History moves on, yet its echoes never fade. In those echoes, The story will find its next path toward the villages that still breathe, the ones that, at the edge of forgotten hills where the roads thinned into mud and bramble, there stood a village that the plague seemed to overlook. No historian ever agreed on its name. Some called it St. Aveline's Rest, others whispered of the Hollow, but maps eventually left it blank, as if embarrassed by its defiance. Travellers who stumbled upon it later described a place too ordinary to notice: timber houses, narrow lanes, a chapel no larger than a barn. Yet the ordinary was its shield. Where cities fell and towns decayed into silence, this little settlement continued to breathe. Each dawn began with the same rituals. The blacksmith stoked his forge before the sun touched the thatch. Farmers walked fields misted in silver dew, their boots sinking into soil that remembered generations of footsteps. Chickens pecked at frost. Smoke climbed from chimneys like gentle prayers. Life persisted in rhythm, cautious yet unbroken. The villagers did not speak much of the sickness beyond the hills. They heard the stories carried by traders before the roads, emptied tales of cities where grass grew in streets and priests buried their own. Then the traders stopped coming, and silence replaced rumour. The narrator moved slowly through the lanes, describing wooden shutters sealed from within, the faint scent of burning herbs curling from each home. A child's laughter flickers in the distance, rare and fragile. The people lived not in denial but in suspension, as if holding their breath for months that turned into years. They avoided strangers, markets, and the luxuries of news. Some claimed it was their obedience that saved them. Others believed it was geography, a valley cradled by winds that carried death elsewhere. But there were those who whispered that something unseen guarded them, something ancient, older than faith. The village priest wrote in his journal, "We have not buried one since the spring. God's hand must rest upon us." Yet he could not explain why birds avoided the church steeple, or why the air seemed to hum on certain nights. The omniscient voice observes this tension with quiet curiosity. Miracles are only mysterious until someone demands proof. The villagers never did. They were too busy tending the living to question why they still lived. Every evening, when shadows stretched across the fields, the villagers gathered near the well not to draw water, but to count faces. They would nod silently, acknowledging survival without celebration. Then each returned home before dark, doors barred, candles shielded. They lived as if watched by something both merciful and stern. No laughter echoed after sunset, no songs carried into the forest. Even hope, though present, learned to whisper. What kept them alive? Luck, instinct, or something forbidden? The narrator poses the question gently, without judgment. Perhaps it was their stillness that protected them. The world outside had been loud, frantic, desperate to act, while this village chose to wait. There is power in inaction, though history rarely rewards it. The villagers understood nothing of contagion, yet they sensed that proximity itself was dangerous. They treated air as sacred distance, and each other as fragile miracles. And so the village endured. Seasons changed, graves overgrew, and the world beyond forgot them. But inside that forgotten pocket of earth, life continued dim, deliberate, enduring. One village stayed alive when fear had become their teacher, and they obeyed without question. It began with doors. Every household sealed them not with locks but with prayer and ash, marking thresholds with signs learned from grandparents whose meanings were already lost. Inside, rooms were scrubbed until wood splintered. Air was perfumed with vinegar and rosemary. Smoke from burning sage turned the interiors pale with haze. To outsiders, it might have looked like madness. To them, it was survival shaped by intuition. They did not know of bacteria or fleas, but they understood contamination in a language older than science, the body's instinctive recoil from the unseen. They spoke little, handled nothing without washing hands in cold water mixed with herbs. Women boiled linens in iron pots. Men burned old clothing in pits beyond the fields. The flames carried away more than fabric. They carried away certainty. Each gesture was an act of faith in ignorance, a ritual born not from understanding but from fear's peculiar wisdom. The narrator moves through the village like smoke, describing each action as both primitive and profound. A mother ties sprigs of lavender above her child's bed, believing scent repels death. An elder insists that sound carries illness, so nights become silent. Even the dogs bark less, as though mimicking their master's restraint. Over time, their discipline becomes their armor. They build distance into their lives until it feels natural. Every week, a bell rings from the chapel, not for mass, but for memory. The priest speaks through the door, his words muffled yet steady. He reminds them that life continues beyond sight, that perhaps God's protection lies not in miracles but in caution. The congregation listens from their thresholds, heads bowed, never gathering, yet united in ritual. The invisible connection between them becomes stronger than proximity ever was. The village well, once its heart, becomes a border. They fetch water only in pairs, each waiting 6 paces apart, lowering buckets with ropes scorched at the ends to discourage touch. When one falls ill from a simple fever, the others build a small hut beyond the orchard. They bring food on trays left at the door. The sick pray alone, hearing voices only in dreams. Most recover. Some vanish quietly into earth, their graves marked with stones uninscribed, as if names might call the sickness back. Fear sharpened their senses until intuition became method. They noticed that wind cleared the air faster than incense. They found that clean hands, though no one knew why, brought fewer funerals. They discovered that hunger slowed the fever's bite, so fasting became holy. Unwittingly, they crafted the first grammar of survival, written not in ink but in repetition. Each act was a syllable of endurance. In these quiet images, the narrator offers neither praise nor pity. The villagers were not heroes, merely human beings cornered by the unknown. Their survival was not defiance but adaptation, the same instinct that keeps a flame alive by shrinking smaller in the wind. They lived cautiously, prayed softly, and waited longer than death's patience. When the next season brought travelers seeking shelter, the villagers refused. It broke their hearts, yet they knew compassion could kill them. They offered food left at the crossroads but barred their gates. The narrator lingers on that image. A loaf of bread resting on a stone, steam rising into morning air, while unseen eyes watch from behind shuttered windows. Fear had taught them boundaries that compassion alone could not cross. They did not understand disease, but they understood fear. And fear, for one, as the months turned to years, the village's survival began to weigh heavier than grief. Living became an act of constant measurement of distance, of silence, of restraint. The human soul was not made to exist in permanent caution. Beneath the calm surface, cracks began to form. One night, a farmer's wife heard her neighbor crying beyond the fence. The sound tore through her resolve. She stepped outside, carrying a candle, and found the woman kneeling beside a covered body, her husband, gone overnight. No priest, no burial rites, just the two of them, and the hush of the wind. Against all the rules, the farmer's wife knelt beside her and helped dig the grave. She told herself it was mercy. By dawn, both were fevered. Days later, both were gone. The others learned the lesson again. Compassion had become dangerous. The narrator observes these moments without judgment, letting the weight settle like dust. Inside the chapel, the priest questioned his faith in whispers no one heard. If mercy brought death, what kind of God demanded distance instead of love? He kept preaching through the door, but his voice grew thinner each week, until one morning the bell rang without him. The villagers buried him behind the church wall, facing east so his silence could greet the dawn. Fear, left too long unchallenged, began to devour its masters. Children grew up without knowing touch. Lovers shared glances but not hands. Weddings were postponed indefinitely. Births dwindled. Laughter sounded foreign. The village survived, but something essential, something invisible was starving. The narrator's tone softens, not with pity but with mourning for the cost of endurance. Survival, it seems, demands more than life. It demands pieces of the soul. Still, light found cracks in the walls. When a storm destroyed the mill, neighbors worked together again, wordlessly passing timber, rebuilding without speaking. For a few hours, cooperation replaced isolation. The rain washed fear from faces. No one died afterward, though no one could explain why. From that day, some began to believe that death no longer watched them so closely, that perhaps compassion itself had become their new protection. The change came slowly. The healer, an old widow named Marnell, started visiting homes again. She carried vinegar cloths and quiet songs. When a child fell ill, she sat outside the door, humming until morning. People began leaving candles for her on their windowsills, a silent form of gratitude. Through her, the village rediscovered what it had lost. Tenderness disguised as practicality. Healing, she reminded them, was not only of the body. As the narrator describes these scenes, the tone grows almost dreamlike. Mist returns to the fields. Deer graze near fences once guarded by fear. Humanity stirs within the survivors like a forgotten melody. They begin planting flowers around graves, washing each stone as if cleansing memory itself. The village transforms not back to what it was, but into something wiser, quieter, more deliberate. They understand that to live fully means accepting risk, that isolation cannot be salvation forever. Yet guilt lingers. At night, they count not only the living but those they refuse to save. Their dreams fill with faces pressed against the gate, voices asking why compassion was rationed like food. The narrator allows this unease to remain unresolved. History rarely grants closure. The audience feels the tension between survival and humanity, recognizing themselves in that timeless dilemma. As spring returns, children chase butterflies near the orchard where plague huts once stood. Their laughter carries freely now, unpunished. The sound drifts into the chapel through its broken window, where the light hits the dust like golden rain. The voiceover slows, describing how the village, once trapped by fear, now treats life itself as sacred ritual. They bury their dead properly again. They sing at dusk. They open doors to travelers. And still no sickness returns. Was it luck? Was it divine mercy? Or did fear, by teaching them caution, leave behind an unspoken wisdom that became their defense forever? The narrator never answers. The mystery remains its own kind of truth, the sort that comforts without resolving. As the camera of the mind drifts upward, showing fields renewed, chimneys smoking, and the soft glow of evening firelight, the voice concludes softly. When fear ruled the earth, kindness became an act of rebellion. And sometimes, the sun hung low over the medieval landscape, casting long shadows over cathedrals and homes alike. The bells, once symbols of divine protection, now tolled with a hollow echo. The plague had shattered the heart of Europe, but it had also begun to erode something more sacred faith. For centuries, the church had been a guiding force in the lives of the people. Now, it stood before them as an ancient, unshakable institution, offering prayers and penance, yet finding no answers. In every village, from the bustling city squares to the forgotten hamlets nestled in valleys, the same story played out. Clergymen, dressed in the heavy robes of their office, raised their hands in solemn prayer, invoking divine intervention, but the bodies kept piling up. There were no miracles, no salvation, and the people, once devout, began to question. Was it possible that their God had abandoned them? Was this divine punishment, or was something else at play? The church's power, once unchallenged, began to unravel. The holy men could no longer assure their followers that God's will was simply a test, a purging of sins. In silence, many began to whisper whispers that travelled faster than the plague itself. Beneath the thick walls of monasteries, away from the prying eyes of the faithful, there were those who had begun to question not just God's will, but the very idea of divine punishment. In the hidden alcoves of these sacred spaces, secret knowledge began to bubble to the surface. Monks, isolated from the chaos, turned their focus not on prayer, but on observation. The narratives they were taught, steeped in holy texts, now clashed with the reality before them. The sick needed remedies, herbal tinctures, potions, poultices, yet this was not the realm of prayer, nor the language of sin. These were strange, foreign methods, practical, grounded, and startlingly effective. The narrator's voice lingers over these monks, the unsung heroes of hidden knowledge. Through fevered research and quiet trials, they began to craft remedies that did not rely on prayer, but on simple, quiet actions. Boiling water, crushing herbs, using the healing properties of the earth. They too believed in God, but they had learned that there were other ways to combat death. They were the early scientists, the dreamers of a future where knowledge would eclipse superstition, even as the world burned with fear. Yet these actions were not welcomed by all, for while these secret experiments provided some hope, the wider world still clung to the idea that only faith could heal. Every sermon warned of sin. It was the people's wrongdoing, their failure to follow the divine path, that had led to this scourge. But the whispers in the dark began to shift. What if there was another answer? What if it wasn't sin, but something far more tangible? The people listened, quietly, as the foundation of belief began to shift beneath their feet. When prayers failed, the narrator murmurs softly, whispers of forbidden. In the midst of the suffering, another figure began to emerge, a shadow, often misunderstood, yet undeniably present. The village healers. In small, dimly lit huts, women, often widows, sometimes herbalists, used the same herbs that the monks had researched, the same methods that, while seen as practical and helpful in private, were now labelled as something darker. To the masses, these women were not saviours. They were witches. The contrast was stark. On one side, the church, cloaked in power, in centuries of doctrine called the plague, God's wrath, laying blame on the people. On the other side, these women, with their hands stained by nature's remedy, spoke not of divine intervention, but of survival. Garlic, lavender, elderberries, these were their tools. Yet in a world that no longer believed in the power of the earth, these tools became sinister. Herbs were no longer simply plants, they became witchcraft. The tone of the narrative grows quieter here, more intimate, as the focus shifts to the villagers who trusted these women with their lives. The old ways, passed down from mothers to daughters, were suddenly tainted with fear. When a woman healed with a poultice of sage, she was called a witch. When a widow gathered herbs at dusk, her silence was mistaken for dark rituals. And in this tension, the villagers' actions, once seen as practical survival, were recast as rebellion. Yet, ironically, some of these witches practiced early medicine in its most primitive form. Though they knew nothing of germs, their insistence on isolation, their use of boiling water, and their knowledge of herbal remedies were eerily similar to the practices of modern-day antisepsis and quarantine. What they didn't understand scientifically, they understood instinctively. The narrator's voice hovers gently over these women herbalists and healers who were neither saints nor sinners, but simply people trying to navigate a world unrecognizable to them. Their actions, viewed through the lens of history, were not so much madness but necessity. They had no choice but to survive, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the science of tomorrow. But for the villagers, their actions had consequences. As the plague spread, so too did the fear of those who offered solutions that defied the religious narrative. Witchcraft, some cried. Dark magic, others whispered. The burning of these women, mostly in public squares, became a ritual of its own, a way to reclaim the power that the church had lost to uncertainty. They called it witchcraft, the narrator whispers. But it was survival disguised as sin. The villagers' instinctive wisdom was punished, though it had saved them from death. A tragedy that still echoes through time. The cost of knowledge when it threatens the established order. In the coming days, the trials of these women would become part of the folklore, written down as cautionary tales for generations to come. But these women, whose names were erased by the flames of fear, were the true pioneers. They practiced what would become modern medicine, long before science could name it. They were not witches, but saviors, working quietly in the shadows, their healing touch forever feared because it existed outside the sanctuary. The air grew thick with suspicion. As the plague took its toll, fear had to find someone to blame. It was no longer enough to pray for salvation. Now, it was necessary to find someone to accuse. And as the church faltered in its attempts to explain the unexplainable, the villagers' old fears, already ancient, were brought back to life. The first whispers of the witch hunts began to stir in the corners of towns and villages, as people turned their eyes to those who were different. Women, often the ones with knowledge of healing or the care of the sick, became targets. They were blamed for the plague. They were accused of summoning it with curses, with potions, with their very existence. A terrible irony. The women who had been the most helpful, who had offered solace, were now the focus of the same fear they had tried to heal. The narrator's voice turns tragic here, moving through these dark moments with care. It paints images of innocent women, their lives and their skills misunderstood as they are dragged before courts. Their trials were not about evidence but about fear, about scapegoats. The very thing that had kept their villages alive was now being used as a reason to kill them. Witch, they called them. Witch, they shouted, as if the word could explain the plague, could make sense of the madness that had taken over Europe. But what the villagers didn't understand was that the fear of witches was not just fear of the unknown, It was fear of control slipping away. Witch hunts were not merely about persecution, but about power. The church needed to restore order, to prove its dominion over the living and the dead, and in doing so, it condemned the very people who had tried to save them. The section ends with a quiet reflection on the injustice that was born from fear. The narrator lingers on these women, now forgotten in history, whose only crime was to help when no one else could. Their deaths would not be the end of the story, but they were the final tragic chapter in a tale of survival and sorrow. When hope died, the narrator says, fear needed a new name, and they called it witch. The persecution of these women did not just stem from the ignorance of disease, but from a system that could not tolerate its failure. The plague had created not only sickness, but a new myth, the myth of the witch. The morning after centuries of mourning came quietly. Across Europe, the air felt lighter not with joy, but with the hollow calm that follows a storm. The world had changed, though no one could yet name how. The plague had taken half of everything, half the people, half the faith, half the certainty. But what remained began to shift in silence. The fields that once required 50 hands now had only 10. The lords, who once commanded from towers of stone, found their commands met with silence. Empty cottages dotted the countryside, doors ajar, tools abandoned mid-task. The survivors looked around and realized the impossible truth. There were too few left to obey, and too much land to work. For the first time, the poor could bargain. The narrator's voice is soft, even tender, as if tracing the quiet heartbeat of rebirth. Across England, France, and beyond, wages rose like seedlings after a fire. Serfs, once bound to the soil, began to walk away. Their footsteps echoed through manors and marketplaces alike, the sound of freedom disguised as necessity. The old world, the world of chains, dues, and unyielding hierarchy, had begun to crack, not from rebellion, but from absence. The dead gave the living a strange gift, the narrator muses. Freedom. It was not a freedom sung from rooftops or written into law. It was a practical, weary kind of liberty. A man who had buried his family could not be easily threatened. A woman who had survived the fever learned to speak her worth. The old masters, weakened by loss, were forced to pay what once was demanded by loyalty. Out of death came negotiation, out of silence came voice. In the cities, guilds formed to protect what few workers remained. Carpenters, masons, bakers all raised their prices, and for the first time, the wealthy found themselves dependent on those they once ignored. Even the church, still mourning its vanished ranks, had to listen more closely to the living. Priests were scarce, faith more private. The idea of authority, so absolute before the plague, now trembled like candlelight in wind. The narrator describes a field where wheat grows wild among forgotten graves. A farmer, kneeling to harvest, pauses as the breeze moves through the stalks, a sound like whispering. The dead, though voiceless, seem to have left instruction. Nature, untamed, had reclaimed dominion, and humanity was forced to learn humility. The tone deepens with slow wonder. It was not revolution by sword or decree, but by vacancy. Feudalism, that ancient order of obedience, began to crumble simply because it could no longer find participants. Lords offered land for labour. Former serfs demanded rights. The wheel of history turned, not through ideology, but through hunger. Yet it was not only work that changed, it was thought. Those who survived could not look upon the world with the same eyes. They had seen too much fragility to believe in permanence. They began to question the structure of everything: law, power, faith, even fate. In taverns and gardens, the first murmurs of human worth began to take form. The narrator concludes this section in gentle reflection. From ashes emerged motion, from ruin, reconstruction. What death had stolen, necessity returned. The world had begun to rebuild itself, not through miracles or monarchs, but through the simple will to live differently. The age of obedience had ended, and in its place, something more. In the wake of despair, curiosity stirred like the first bird call after endless night. The survivors, those who had witnessed the end of the world, now turned their eyes toward understanding it. Europe, scarred and sobered, began to move again not toward conquest but toward comprehension. Trade routes reopened, and with them, the flow of ideas. Merchants once feared for spreading the plague now became messengers of thought. Ships carried not just spices and silk, but questions. Along the same harbours where rats once crawled ashore, men now spoke of distant lands, strange stars, and unseen forces. The air itself seemed to hum with the possibility of discovery. The narrator's voice drifts between wonder and melancholy. The plague had stolen certainty. In its absence, curiosity bloomed. After silence came questioning, and after questioning came connection. The very fear that once isolated humanity now linked it anew. Pilgrims walked the same paths that had once carried disease, seeking not relics but knowledge. Monks translated old Greek manuscripts. Scholars debated not only theology but the natural order. What once had been heresy now whispered promise. The omniscient tone slows to reveal scenes of small miracles. An apothecary mixing herbs with newfound precision. A young student sketching the bones of an animal, not to worship but to learn. A merchant in Florence paying for books instead of jewels. Curiosity became the new currency. After silence came curiosity, the narrator says softly, and the world began to ask questions again. Those questions spread like seeds, scattered by the same winds that once carried death. Why do we sicken? Why do we heal? Why does the sun rise, the same for the sinner and the saint? These were no longer dangerous thoughts, they were necessary ones. The great cathedrals, once monuments of unchallenged faith, now stood beside libraries, laboratories, and workshops. Light, once trapped in stained glass, began to find its reflection in ink and parchment. The people who had learned to fear touch now learned to touch the world differently with tools, with curiosity, with imagination. And so began the slow rebirth of reason. The narrator lingers on this transformation. Where once smoke from funeral pyres darkened the sky, now the smoke of forges rose, crafting tools instead of coffins. Humanity was learning again how to make, rather than mourn. Still, the shift was fragile. There were those who resisted, who saw danger in thought itself. The church watched carefully, balancing revelation and restraint. But history, once awakened, could not return to sleep. Merchants, travellers, and scholars carried the light of knowledge across borders. In Italy, humanists rediscovered ancient philosophies. In France, alchemists turned from mysticism to chemistry. In the East, mathematicians refined ideas that would shape the modern age. The world was still recovering, still haunted, but its fear had taken a new form, the fear of ignorance. By the time this section closes, the tone has shifted fully from despair to quiet wonder. The world had suffered unspeakable loss, but from its ruins arose an appetite for truth that no plague could extinguish. The scars of the Black Death had become the fingerprints of In the generations that followed, the memory of death slowly turned into the machinery of life. Across Europe, the survivors' descendants built not just cities, but systems. The lessons written in ashes became laws. The wisdom of fear became policy. The narrator describes this new world like a dream slowly finding its form. In the ports of Venice, quarantine stations were built, vast complexes where ships waited before entering harbour. The word times, 40 giorni, times 40 days, became the standard of safety, a mathematical shield born from medieval desperation. From that practice, modern public health took root. Anatomists began to study the human body in secret. They sketched muscles and organs, once forbidden by doctrine, in search of divine design within flesh itself. The church, still cautious, allowed a small crack in its wall of silence, and through it the light of inquiry streamed. Herbalists began cataloguing their cures. Physicians wrote manuals describing symptoms and treatments with precision. The mysterious art of healing began its slow transformation into science. To survive the Black Death, the narrator intones, was to unknowingly invent the modern world. The contrast deepens the same fear that once paralyzed humanity now guided its progress. From burned homes rose clean streets. From despairing isolation came sanitation laws. Even architecture changed. Cities widened their roads to let in air and light, unconsciously designing for a future that feared darkness. The omniscient voice weaves between awe and calm analysis. The same species that once hid from the unseen now sought to name it, to measure it, to understand it. Death had taught humanity patience, observation, and humility. It had turned superstition into discipline. Every grave became a silent teacher, every loss a lesson written in invisible ink. The narrator slows, painting final vignettes. A scholar in a candlelit room tracing the stars, believing their patterns reflect not divine wrath but natural law. A farmer experimenting with crop rotation, having learned the fragility of life and land. A mother teaching her child to wash hands before meals, unaware she's preserving the instinct that once saved entire villages. Each image carries the same refrain. Survival was not merely endurance, it was adaptation, memory, and transformation. The human spirit, fragile yet stubborn, had taken death's greatest blow and responded by reimagining life. As the section closes, the narrator's tone softens into reflective peace. The great silence that once covered Europe had given way to murmurs of invention, of poetry, of painting, of thought. The Renaissance did not erupt suddenly. It unfolded quietly, like dawn. From the darkness rose art, science, and philosophy. From tragedy, understanding. And from the ruins of fear, curiosity eternal. The story pauses in stillness, as though watching the first morning sun touch the stone. The ink on parchment faded, and so did the towns. History, it seems, is not only written by the survivors but also by the ones who choose to remember. The plague, though it ravaged with a relentless ferocity, also erased itself from memory in the most peculiar way. Not through silence, but through omission. Entire villages, once full of life and movement, slipped through the cracks of time, leaving behind only the faintest traces, unspoken names, unmarked graves, and unremembered souls. Some towns vanished so completely, even memory forgot them. They had been erased not by the cruelty of time, but by the indifference of history itself. In the years that followed, chroniclers who ventured to tell the story of the plague could only speak of cities, of great capitals, of the noble and the learned. Yet the forgotten villages, the ones that had endured in their small, quiet way, were left behind. They were lost in the fog of epidemic, their names disappearing from the scrolls like dust in wind. The narrator's voice is calm, almost meditative, as it paints the image of monks in darkened rooms, their quills scratching out the stories they felt were worthy of telling. They wrote about the cities that crumbled, the noble deaths, the saintly suffering, but what of the humble farmers who died quietly in their homes, their bodies forgotten before the earth could even swallow them? These were not stories for the scholars to tell, and so they were lost. But it was not just the names that disappeared. Whole histories were removed from the annals of time, gently erased by the hands of the church, whose chroniclers preferred tales that were less raw, less real. In this quiet censorship, entire ways of life vanished without a trace. How many peasants perished? How many tradesmen? How many children never saw the harvest? These were questions that the storytellers, whether by choice or by ignorance, could not answer. It's easy to forget that entire towns, where children once ran through streets and lovers walked hand in hand, simply ceased to exist. They were replaced by empty fields or abandoned hamlets. Each new term, a thin veil to hide what had been lost. The village of St. Aveline's Rest, once bustling with life, was no longer remembered by name. Only its smoke-filled past, its ruins, remained as a ghost to the future. The narrator invites the listener to reflect on this eerie disappearance. What happened to these places? Were they so insignificant that they left no mark? Or was there something more deliberate at work, a sweeping of the dead under the rug of collective memory? The truth, it seems, lies somewhere between the pages of history and the voices of the forgotten. The eerie calm of this section lingers. The weight of absence, the shadows of what is no longer there, quietly pressing in. Some towns vanished so completely, the narrator muses softly. Even memory forgot them. The chapter transitions with a soft shift in tone, like the turning of a page. History, it seems, is as much about what is lost as what is recorded. From the silence of these forgotten towns, we move into the realm where the story of death becomes art. A transformation of terror into something unexpected. When life is lost in such massive waves, it's no surprise that the human spirit, fragile yet stubborn, found a way to respond not with fear alone, but with expression. Art, in its many forms, began to speak the unspeakable, transforming trauma into something tangible. It was as if the brushstrokes and melodies, born from suffering, became a salve for the wounded soul. The narrator's voice deepens as it describes the haunting beauty of the dance of death, the skeletal frescoes that decorated church walls, the macabre paintings that adorned the chapels. These were not mere depictions of death, but profound reflections on life's fragility. In one village, a mural depicted a figure dancing with the skeleton of life, their forms entwined in a timeless embrace. It was a reminder that death was never far from life. It was simply the other side of the same coin. Even the most innocent of lullabies became infused with the spectre of mortality. Songs that once soothed children's restless nights now carried the weight of grief, each note a reminder that there was no guarantee of tomorrow. These were not songs of despair, but of acceptance, a recognition that life, in all its fleeting beauty, must always be tempered by the knowledge of its end. The omniscient narrator describes a medieval poet who, in the wake of the plague, wrote verses not of hope, but of remembrance. His words, though sombre, carried a quiet grace, as if he were holding the hand of death and walking with it rather than running from it. The poet wrote of love lost, of promises unkept, of the faces that would never smile again. His words resonated not just with those who mourned, but with the generations that would follow, for they spoke not of death itself, but of the reverence we owe to the lives that came before us. It is here that the narrator draws a connection between beauty and decay, the idea that from suffering emerges art, and from art, meaning. Just as the skeletal figures danced on the walls, so too did the survivors continue their march through history, armed with their new creations, frescoes, songs, poetry reminders that even in the darkest times, humanity seeks to create, to leave behind traces of beauty for future generations. Even the art began to whisper. The narrator says gently, "We were here, once." The scene shifts, but the feeling lingers. Art, in the aftermath of tragedy, is a vessel for memory, a container for the grief that cannot be spoken. The beauty born from decay becomes the bedrock upon which future civilizations build. And in the ashes, there is a quiet promise that even in the darkest days, the human spirit will find a way to speak, to create, to immortalize. The narrator's voice softens as the transition to the next section begins. History is no longer just something that is recorded. It is something that is lived, breathed, and passed down through the generations. The truth of the plague, once hidden in shadows, now emerges through the art of those who survived. But this truth is not just recorded, it is mythologized. The line between reality and imagination begins to blur. The myths of the plague grew like weeds in the fertile soil of fear. What was once fact, the sight of bodies piling up, the silence that fell over cities soon transformed into stories, legends, and, ultimately, folklore. These stories, shaped by the minds of survivors, became more than just coping mechanisms. They became the way humanity explained the unexplainable. The narrator shifts here, soft and meditative, drawing attention to the eerie folklore that grew in the wake of the plague. Bells that rang at midnight, their chimes carrying the souls of the dead. Phantom ships that appeared on the horizon, their sails tattered, their holds empty ghostly reminders that death had no borders. Spectral processions that paraded through the streets, bearing the likeness of the plague itself, as though the disease was not a simple illness, but a force of nature. In these tales, death was no longer an event, it was a presence, a shadow that walked among the living, guiding them, haunting them, never leaving. Some believed that the souls of the dead wandered, seeking rest in the homes of the living, while others believed that the very earth itself was cursed, tainted by the blood of those who had died. Every part of the natural world, the trees, the rivers, the stones, was now imbued with the memory of death. The narrator introduces one such legend, a ship that was said to have sailed from the Black Sea, its crew all dead, the ship carried on by the winds alone. The people who saw it believed it was a harbinger of doom, a ghost ship that would forever haunt their dreams. Was it real? Or was it merely the collective fear of a world still trembling in the aftermath of the plague? The narrator allows the ambiguity to linger, inviting the audience to decide for themselves whether the myth was true or simply the creation of a frightened mind. When history couldn't explain death, the narrator muses, myth stepped in to finish the story. These myths, born from terror, soon became part of the cultural fabric. They explained the unexplainable and provided a sense of control over the uncontrollable. They gave the survivors something to hold on to, stories that made sense of the chaos. And yet, as the centuries passed, these myths took on lives of their own, evolving and transforming as they were retold. The transition to the end of the section is gradual. The narrator reflects on the power of myth to shape reality, and how the story of the plague, once rooted in painful truth, eventually became the stuff of legend. The real horror of the plague was not just in the bodies it claimed, but in the stories it left behind, stories that would echo through history, shifting from fact to folklore, from reality to myth. As the section closes, the voice lowers to a whisper. The myths are still with us today, lingering in the corners of our minds, waiting to be rediscovered by those who seek the deeper meaning behind the story. The world was never as isolated as history often suggests. Across the oceans, beneath the endless skies, ships glided into harbours, carrying not just goods but something far darker. While Europe writhed in the grip of death, the plague was a shadow that stretched farther than the continent's walls. Its arrival was not heralded by the clash of swords, but by the murmur of water against hulls, by the silent, unnoticed exchange of cargo that crossed the world. In every corner of the earth, from the bustling streets of Cairo to the desert sands of Asia, death moved quietly among men, hidden in the creases of a journey. When the bells stopped ringing in Europe, the narrator muses, other lands had already heard their echo. It began slowly, as these things often do. In the markets of Cairo, the spices once traded freely grew scarce. Merchants, whose trade had once flowed effortlessly between Constantinople and Samarkand, began to murmur of strange deaths among the caravanserais. The sound of sick travellers, lying still on their beds, never to rise. And in those quiet, dust-choked streets, the familiar rhythms of trade silk, salt and spices were forever altered by a far more insidious cargo. The plague had entered Asia. The journey was long, and death did not rush, but it travelled relentlessly, leaving behind a wake of ruined villages and forgotten names. From the Mongol Empire to the markets of India, the plague followed its own quiet path, as though it too understood the power of time. It crept into each civilization, leaving it on the brink of silence, mirroring the same terror that had already consumed Europe. The narrator's voice is both omniscient and intimate, drawing viewers into the story of forgotten places. The merchants of Samarkand, who traded not just gold but stories of how the plague turned their prosperous city into a ghost town, where only the faintest echoes of traders remained. The contrast between the cities and villages is stark. While the nobles of the West turned their backs and fled, the traders of the East continued to exchange goods, seemingly oblivious to the death that followed. Yet no matter the location or the people, the result was always the same. The familiar sounds of life began to fade. No bells tolled, no laughter rang out. In every port, the shadow of the plague stretched farther, darkening the lives it touched. The real horror, as the narrator slowly reveals, was not just the illness, but the silence that followed it. No great battle was fought in these distant lands. No kings fell in front of their armies. No glory was won or lost. Instead, power drained away as quietly as the wind carries dust, scattered without any fanfare. Empires did not crumble from wars or uprisings. They crumbled from silence, from the absence of life, from the absence of breath. The sudden and slow devastation of Asia was not a military conquest, but a reminder that human fragility connects civilizations far more deeply than the greatest conquests ever could. And yet, in the very same places that the plague ravaged, an important and invisible shift began to unfold, the moment when observation began to replace fear, and knowledge began to be sought where silence once reigned. Asterisk. The narrator gently transitions, as if urging the audience to look beyond what was lost to what was found. Asterisk. The East had always held knowledge, some of it ancient, some of it newly discovered. And as Europe's silence echoed across the seas, the lands beyond had already begun to shape new paths forward, slowly turning the wheels of the East, long known for its rich tradition of learning, now became the repository of forgotten knowledge. While Europe drowned in its superstitions, the people of the East, shaped by centuries of accumulated wisdom, began to observe, to understand, and to adapt. They did not turn to the heavens for answers as quickly as their Western counterparts. Instead, they turned to the earth itself, to nature, to the simple remedies and practices that, unknown to them, were the very beginnings of modern science. They called it divine punishment, the narrator says softly. Others called it observation. In the midst of suffering, the Islamic scholars in Persia, Syria, and Egypt began to study the plague with a practical mind. The word quarantine was born in these centuries, as scholars in Damascus and Baghdad noted the efficacy of isolating the sick to prevent further transmission. Their early hospitals, already sophisticated for their time, transformed into places of refuge where the sick were segregated from the healthy. These early practices were not rooted in religion, but in the quiet observation of what worked and what did not. And in China, ancient herbal texts describing contagion had been passed down from generation to generation. These texts, once dismissed by Europe as mere superstition, were now revered as guides to survival. They told of how certain plants, garlic, ginger, and ginseng, could purify the air and fortify the body against illness. Though their explanations were not scientific by today's standards, their wisdom would later prove to be incredibly effective, serving as the foundations for what would become modern antiseptic and immunological practices. Yet perhaps the most surprising were the Indian villages, where the plague's effect was far less destructive than in Europe. Isolation customs, practiced by villagers for centuries, had kept the contagion at bay. They kept their communities closed, observing strict quarantine measures long before they had any concept of germs or bacteria. There were no grand buildings or sophisticated research institutions, but the wisdom of isolation passed down orally through generations became their shield. As the plague spread, the East's response was not one of panic, but of systematic observation. They saw the signs of illness and understood how to manage them. Their knowledge, though based on intuition and ancient understanding, had been a bridge between the old world and the new. They had found ways to protect themselves while the West, caught in its web of divine retribution, refused to look at the world in any way other than through the lens of sin. This was a moment in time when the East and West stood in stark contrast. Where the West saw sickness as punishment, the East saw it as something to be understood. Where Europe burned witches for practicing what they called magic, the East practiced medicine, gathering knowledge like pearls, using the lessons of the past to guide them. The toll of the plague was felt differently in these regions, not just in terms of death, but in terms of the wisdom they carried forward. Observation, the narrator reflects, was their salvation, while fear was Europe's downfall. As civilizations in the East began to adapt to the plague, Europe struggled with its ignorance. Fear remained their dominant force. They turned away from practical knowledge and clung to faith as a shield against the unknown. Meanwhile, in Asia, knowledge flowed freely, despite the barriers that separated them from the rest of the world. The East had known the power of learning for centuries, and it was now that very knowledge that would shape their survival. The section closes with a gentle shift, moving toward the idea that the great empires of the East, though battered by the plague, were also learning, adapting, and evolving. As Europe turned inward, Asia turned outward, and in doing so, the wisdom of the East began to reach. As the plague spread relentlessly across continents, it touched more than just the people. It touched the very core of empires. The Mongol Empire, vast and proud, saw its power slowly erode as the disease tore through its ranks. Though their armies were fierce and their cities fortified, the Mongols could not escape the invisible enemy that moved faster than their horses. Whole towns emptied in the blink of an eye, and trade routes that once connected the world now lay silent, like ghostly remnants of a forgotten age. The empire, though still standing in name, was fractured at its heart. The narrator paints the image of a once great empire, now scattered. The Mongols, masters of vast stretches of land from China to Eastern Europe, watched helplessly as their cities fell one by one. The empire crumbled not in battle, but in breath. The plague reached even the most powerful, the most feared. The loss was not just of life, but of spirit. The Mongol Empire began to retreat from the edges of the known world, pulled back by the same force that had ravaged Europe. The same story unfolded in the Ottoman heartlands. In Constantinople, the great city that straddled the line between East and West, the plague reshaped the flow of power. Once a vibrant metropolis, it became a shadow of its former self, its streets eerily quiet. The Ottomans, though still formidable, began to reorganize, not for conquest but for survival. The nature of power itself was shifting. Empires that once thrived on expansion now focused on preservation. The plague's true devastation lay not in what it destroyed, but in what it left behind. Empires no longer stood on the shoulders of power, but on the foundation of survival. The rise and fall of kingdoms had always been marked by blood and swords, But now it was marked by breath, by survival, by sheer will. As the narrator weaves through these fallen kingdoms, it becomes clear that power was never meant to last forever. It was fragile, breakable, like glass, and the plague had shattered it. Empires do not crumble from swords alone, the narrator says quietly. Sometimes it is from a single cough. As the remnants of these great empires began to fall into memory, something else was rising, an unseen force, more subtle, more enduring. The survivors. They were the ones who learned to adapt, who understood that survival meant not clinging to power but sharing it. As the old ways of ruling collapsed, the new ways of cooperation, community, and innovation began to take root. And so, as these vast empires were torn asunder by an invisible enemy, the survivors, the farmers, the merchants, the scholars, began to rebuild not just what had been lost, but what had never been built in the first place. A world founded on mutual understanding, shared knowledge, and the quiet wisdom of those who lived through it all. The section concludes with a slow fade into the distant future, where the echoes of the plague still reverberate. The world may have been reshaped, but the survivors, those who learned the hardest lessons, were the ones who... What do the dead teach the living? The question lingers in the stillness left behind by the plague. For centuries, humans had treated death as a companion of sorts, a shadow that followed them from cradle to grave, a familiar stranger at every door. But then came the plague, and death, once distant, became a constant presence. It visited every home, it touched every life, and in its wake, it left more than just bodies, it left lessons. We turn our gaze to the survivors, those who, in the midst of devastation, learned to survive. The world they knew was one of sickness and loss, but from this reality arose a strange, quiet wisdom. Villages that had once crowded with laughter and chatter now stood eerily silent, their streets swept clean, their houses sealed against unseen enemies. And yet, beneath the silence, something was growing, something both simple and profound, new rules of living. The omniscient narrator gently guides us through these villages, where fear became more than a reaction, it became law. The villagers, though never formally educated, were quick to realize that survival required a new order. Doors were bolted shut, not just to keep invaders out, but to keep contagion in check. The common well, once a shared resource, became the subject of cautious scrutiny. In some villages, it was no longer just water that was drawn, but ritual buckets drawn by hand, iron-bound and clean. The narrator's tone is soft, reverent, almost hypnotic, as it reflects on the seemingly irrational rituals that began to emerge. What was once superstition became law. Villagers began to burn the clothes of the dead, not just to keep disease from spreading, but because they believed that the very fabric carried the weight of their last breath. It was not science, nor reason that guided them, but instinct. An instinct born from terror, yes, but also from the urgent need to find control in a world suddenly too chaotic to understand. They began to isolate, not knowing that quarantine, though not named, was the key to survival. They washed their hands with herbs, garlic, rosemary, lavender, whose properties they didn't understand but whose effects were undeniable. Even the smoke that rose from burning sage and myrrh wasn't just ritual. It was an ancient practice of purification, one that the plague had made sacred. The voice remained steady, almost reflective, inviting viewers to recognize the evolution of behavior. Fear, once a momentary reaction, had now become embedded in culture. Superstitions, born of survival instinct, became the foundation of public health laws centuries later. The villagers, in their ignorance, had unknowingly set the stage for future generations to codify what they had learned through death. There is wisdom in fear, the narrator notes, and their fear became our law. In the quiet corners of these villages, where the plague's shadow still loomed, the survivors continued to live by rules no one could name but everyone understood. The roads remained empty, the houses dark, but from these darkened streets arose something undeniable. The first, fragile, principles of public health, born not from knowledge, but from a primal need to survive. As the section concludes, the voice slowly transitions, suggesting that from physical laws came something more, moral laws. These actions, once grounded in instinct, would eventually become the foundation of empathy, of compassion, new principles, born from the very same fear that had once. The plague, with its horrific toll, had a strange effect on human nature. While fear tightened its grip on the world, something unexpected blossomed in the hearts of the survivors' mercy. As the corpse piles grew and graves outnumbered families, compassion, once an abstract notion, became an act of rebellion. The narrator reflects softly on the changing nature of death and dying. In the early days of the plague, death was a private matter, a family affair. Bodies were buried quickly, and the grieving was done in solitude. But as the numbers swelled, death became public. It no longer belonged to one house, one family. It had taken the village, and now it was part of the community, a heavy burden on every doorstep. When every home became a tomb, the narrator whispers, mercy was the only rebellion left. This rebellion took many forms. It was in the mothers who, though their own children had perished, took in orphaned children and raised them as their own. It was in the villagers who, in the midst of their own mourning, fed the poor and sick, even though they had nothing left to give. It was in the priests who, despite their own fear, continued to administer last rites, even when the ceremony itself seemed futile. The tone of the narrator grows deeper here, contrasting the indifference that existed before the plague. In the days before the great disease, death had been something that others faced, not the rulers, not the rich, not the powerful. But after the plague, all men and women, regardless of station, stood equal before the grave. The wealth of kings could not protect them, nor could the prayers of priests save them. Death had a new face, democratic, equal, and unrelenting. The survivors, seeing death as no respecter of persons, began to realize that survival did not mean just outlasting death, but living with it, living with the knowledge that no one was immune. And so, their compassion grew, for it was their only shield against the overwhelming sense of loss. The birth of hospitals, orphanages, and poor relief movements can be traced to these moments, when the village, in the absence of faith and order, turned toward each other. Mercy, in a world so cruel, became the only weapon left to the living. The emotional impact here is profound. Viewers feel the weight of loss, but are also buoyed by the quiet acts of humanity that arose from it. The survival instinct, once solely about preserving one's own life, evolved into an instinct to preserve the life of others. The plague had stripped society of its vanity, leaving behind only the most basic truths, that to be human is to care for others, even when there is nothing left to offer. The section ends with a quiet reflection on how compassion became not just a moral choice, but a necessity. In the midst of ruin, mercy became the cornerstone of rebuilding. And as the story transitions, the narrator hints that this shift would not only redefine human action, it would read in the shadow of the plague, as the world began to recover, something else began to stir, a quiet revolution of thought. For centuries, humanity had relied on divine explanations for the events that shaped its world. The plague, however, had no divine answer. No prayers, no piety, no rituals had halted its advance. And in that silence, the first stirrings of doubt began to arise. The narrator shifts here, almost imperceptibly, from the emotional and moral to the intellectual. The plague, though it had wrought destruction on a scale few could comprehend, also gave birth to a new way of thinking. The survivors, having lived through the collapse of the old world, now began to question it. What was it, after all, that governed the world? Was it divine will, or something else entirely? After the prayers stopped, the narrator says softly, questions began to whisper. The whispering began with the scholars, those who had once been content to accept the will of God in all things. They had seen the failure of faith, and in its absence, they began to ask questions that, though they seemed innocent, would come to shake the foundations of centuries of belief. Why did some die and others live? Why did the rich suffer the same fate as the poor? What caused disease, and could it be prevented? These were questions not born of heresy, but of curiosity. The Renaissance, though still distant, began in these small acts of questioning. The inquisitive minds of the survivors, who had seen the limits of divine intervention, began to seek answers in observation, in reason, in science. Anatomy became more than just a theological study. It became an exploration of the human body, a pursuit of knowledge. Herbal remedies became not just folk wisdom, but the beginnings of modern pharmacology. The plague had broken the faith of the masses, but it had also opened the doors to a new kind of wisdom. The voice grows reflective, noting that the intellectual courage that arose from despair was not rebellion, it was curiosity returning. The survivors were not rejecting faith, but seeking a different path, one rooted in reason rather than revelation. For the first time in centuries, the world seemed to open to the possibility that perhaps the answers had always been there, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be understood. And so, as Europe began to rebuild itself, the foundations of the modern world began to take shape. The story ends not with finality, but with a gentle hum of possibilities. The Renaissance, though still years away, had been quietly planted in the hearts of the survivors, watered by the doubts and questions that arose from the most tragic of human experiences. The whisper of questions, the narrator reflects softly, would grow. In the dim glow of neon lights, the world looks familiar. The streets are busy, as they always have been, though now the hum of activity is accompanied by the flicker of screens and the rush of traffic. Yet, beneath the surface, something ancient stirs, a pattern that repeats itself in the shadows of history. The sound of hurried footsteps, of masked faces, of eyes darting nervously. These are not new things. We have lived through these moments before. The narrator's voice is soft, almost detached, as if watching from a distance, observing, but not intervening. The world has changed in its outward form, yes. We have built cities that shine under artificial light, designed machines that can think for us, and crafted tools that promise to solve the problems that once felt insurmountable. But there is a quiet parallel in the air, a whisper of something old, a shadow of fear that still clings to the edges of our modern lives. We learned everything, the narrator says, except how to listen to the past. The world, in all its complexity, remains as fragile as it was in the days of the Black Death. We thought we had learned the lessons of our forebears, thought we had moved beyond their ignorance and superstition. And yet, here we are again. The world stumbles through waves of misinformation, denial, and confusion, echoes of a time when fear distorted truth and faith replaced reason. The narrator does not accuse but simply observes. Humans are creatures of habit, and some habits are deeply ingrained, passed down like a forgotten song. The comparisons between past and present are subtle, almost hypnotic. In the days of the plague, people turned to prayer, to rituals, to protection they did not fully understand. Today, we turn to data, to technology, to systems that promise to manage chaos. And yet, the underlying fear remains the same. The refusal to accept what cannot be controlled, the need to protect ourselves from what we cannot see, the hunger for certainty in an uncertain world, all of these impulses stretch across the centuries. The pandemic of today, like the plague of centuries past, has stirred the same emotions: fear, denial, resistance. People seek to understand, to grasp control, to find a scapegoat. And the more we try to control, the more we find ourselves trapped in a cycle of repetition. The tools have changed. Yes, computers, medicine, surveillance, but the psychology remains the same. The narrator pauses, as if inviting the listener to reflect on these cycles. What does history teach us? It teaches us that we forget. It teaches us that the patterns of fear, of pride, and of resistance to the unknown are not new. They are as old as the human heart itself. The same fears that haunted medieval peasants now haunt us, dressed in different clothes. The denial of the past, the refusal to learn from it, seems to be humanity's greatest flaw. And yet, the narrator does not offer judgment. Instead, there is a quiet acceptance. This, too, is part of being human. And so, the silence that followed the plague, the silence we are still experiencing today, is not something that has arrived for the first time. It is part of an ancient rhythm, a rhythm that, though we struggle to hear it, centuries have passed, and the tools we use to deal with fear have evolved. No longer do we turn to prayers alone, or to herbs and talismans. Today, we turn to data, to algorithms, to vaccines and masks. The technology of the modern world promises us control. It tells us that we are no longer at the mercy of the unseen. We can track it, predict it, manage it. But is it enough? The narrator's voice, though calm, carries an undercurrent of quiet reflection. The tools we have today are powerful, yes, but they are also a reminder of how fragile we remain. In the face of the unknown, we still reach for control, still try to bend the world to our will. Masks, quarantines, social distancing, these are the modern-day equivalents of the isolation practices of the past. We do not burn clothes or bury our dead with speed and secrecy, but we do close borders, lock doors, and separate ourselves from the world outside. The connection between past and present is made clear. The human response to danger has not changed. What was once called superstition is now called public health policy. The same impulse to protect ourselves from an invisible threat persists. The tools have changed, but the fear has not. The narrator highlights the eerie familiarity in our current methods, how we monitor, restrict, and isolate, much like the villagers of the past, who knew nothing of germs, but understood the need for boundaries. They created their own methods of control, just as we do now. Centuries passed, the narrator observes, but our fear never evolved, only our tools did. As we look back, it becomes clear that the more we strive for control, the more we expose our vulnerability. We can map the world, track the virus, and build technologies that promise safety. But even as we do so, we remain susceptible to the same fears that have always plagued us. The desire for security, for predictability, remains at the heart of our responses to disaster. In this sense, the modern world is not so different from the medieval one. We have replaced the church with the state, prayer with medicine, but the same primal instincts drive us. The narrator's tone shifts slightly, moving toward a more contemplative mood. The question arises, are we truly progressing, or are we merely repeating the same cycles, dressed in new clothes? Perhaps progress is not the absence of fear, but the recognition of it. Perhaps what we have truly learned is not how to banish fear, but how to live with it, how to understand its role in shaping our world. The world's obsession with control is not the result of newfound wisdom, but of an old, unshakable desire to keep the unknown at bay. As the section ends, the voice lingers on this paradox. The world has evolved, yes, but not in the ways we might expect. Progress is not always linear, and perhaps, in the end, the tools we create to fight fear are as much a part of the fear itself as the disease. In the silence that follows every tragedy, there is a moment of rebirth. It is in this silence that humanity, broken and fragile, begins to find its voice again. The rhythm of the world does not stop with the plague, nor with the pandemic. It shifts, ever so slightly, but it moves forward. And in that forward movement, there is the echo of resilience, the pulse of creation. The narrator's voice carries a quiet optimism as it reflects on the natural cycle of life and death. After every plague, after every silence, the world begins again. It begins with grief, yes, but it also begins with hope. The dead are mourned, the survivors rebuild, and from the ashes of despair comes the song of life. The rhythm of civilization is not progress for its own sake. It is a continuous cycle of loss and recovery, of destruction and rebirth. Every culture that has endured the silence of the plague has also found a way to sing again. The streets may be empty, the markets silent, but they do not stay that way. Out of the quiet comes new art, new thought, new life. The human spirit, though bruised, never breaks. It bends, it falters, but it always rises again. The world's great movements, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, all grew from the same soil of despair and hope. These moments of rebirth, the narrator muses, are not moments of change in the world's great systems. They are the heartbeat of civilization itself. Every silence the world endures teaches it how to sing again, the narrator whispers. And in every song, there is the promise of a new dawn. The transitions from fear to hope are as subtle as the changing seasons. The narrator traces the slow rise of humanity, from the mourning of the dead to the celebration of life. The emotional cadence here is almost lullaby-like, drawing the listener into the steady, comforting rhythm of survival. Every great tragedy is followed by a quieter, more intimate resurrection. The world does not forget the dead. It honors them by living, by creating, by pushing forward. And so, as the silence of the pandemic gives way to the sound of life, we are reminded that humanity's greatest strength lies not in our ability to avoid destruction, but in our capacity to rebuild. In every rebuilt home, every reworked canvas, every new song, there is the proof of our resilience. It is this resilience that defines civilization more than any single advance in science or technology. The narrator concludes this section with a soft invitation to listen, to listen not just to the sound of the world, but to the echoes of the past, to hear the lessons of those who came before, who too lived through cycles of fear and recovery. In this continuity, in this repetition, we find our shared humanity. The world has always sought answers in the heavens. For centuries, the bells of cathedrals rang out over every town, each chime a call to gather, a reminder that salvation was something to be found together, as a people, as a community. The bells, grand and resounding, were symbols of external power of a higher will that demanded collective attention. And the people, in turn, responded in kind. They knelt together, prayed together, and lived together under the weight of divine expectation. But then came the plague, and with it, a silence that could not be quelled by even the most sacred sound. The bells no longer rang with assurance, nor with the promise of safety. Instead, they told the heavy sound of loss, of desperation, and of the knowledge that no prayer could stop the inevitable. In the aftermath, something began to shift, not in the physical world, but in the world of the spirit. Where once there was faith in the spectacle of religion, there was now the quiet of individual reflection. The narrator's voice is slow, meditative, as it contrasts the grand, sweeping gestures of worship with the private, inward prayers of a wounded humanity. The great cathedrals, once the gathering places for entire villages, now stood empty in the quiet of the aftermath. Those who survived did not find solace in the rituals they had once believed in. Instead, they turned inward, seeking not salvation from above, but understanding from within. When the heavens stayed silent, the narrator observes, humanity began to listen inward. The shift is subtle but profound. The grand processions, the booming prayers, the collective faith, they were replaced by moments of stillness. People did not seek to answer the questions of the heavens. They sought to answer the questions within. What was the meaning of life, if death could strike without warning? What did it mean to be human, if even the most devout were not spared? And so, people turned to themselves for answers, seeking not external salvation but personal understanding. This shift, though, was not easy. The transition from collective faith to individual reflection was fraught with doubt and fear. No longer were the answers written in holy texts or spoken by priests. Now, they were sought in the quiet, in the moments between breaths, in the silence of the night. The world had been torn apart, and with it, the illusions of certainty. But in that silence, in that uncertainty, there emerged a new kind of spirituality, a quieter, more introspective understanding of the divine. The narrator's tone grows softer as it reflects on the beauty of this transformation. It is not a rejection of faith, but a redefinition of it. Faith no longer needed to be loud or outwardly visible to be meaningful. It could be found in a whispered prayer, in a moment of solitude, in the quiet knowledge that the divine could be found within. And so, as the world changed, so too did humanity's relationship with the divine. The section closes with a subtle shift in direction, as the narrator hints at the next evolution, from faith inward to memory outward. What humanity learned, what it chose to remember and forget, would become the foundation for the next. Memory, like faith, is both fragile and enduring. In the wake of the plague, as the dead were buried and the survivors began the painful task of rebuilding, they found themselves haunted not just by the faces of the lost, but by the lessons they had learned through suffering. Those lessons were not forgotten. They were woven into the very fabric of life, passed down through generations, etched into the very stones of cities and villages. The narrator gently guides us through the remnants of this memory. The cemeteries turned into gardens, the monasteries that became schools, the symbols of death that transformed into symbols of life. What once had been a reminder of mortality now became a testament to survival. The walls that had witnessed death now held the stories of those who lived. The ashes of the dead gave birth to the seeds of the future. In this quiet transformation, the audience begins to understand how memory becomes identity. The plague, though it had devastated, had also engraved itself into the landscape of Europe. It shaped not only the way people lived, but the way they remembered. The monuments to the dead were not simply tombs, they were also memorials to life, to the lessons learned, to the humanity that survived. The past never vanished, the narrator whispers. It just changed its name. In every corner of the continent, The marks of the plague were visible in the architecture, in the art, in the culture. The people rebuilt their cities, but they rebuilt them differently. They created spaces not just for life, but for remembrance. Every graveyard that became a garden, every school that rose from the ashes of a monastery, was a statement that death, though powerful, did not have the final word. Memory was the final word. The narrator's voice grows reverent as it describes these small but significant shifts. Even the language changed. Idioms that had once been simple became loaded with meaning. Phrases like "from the ashes," "to rise again," and "to weather the storm" took on new depth, as they became not just metaphors but reminders of what had been lost and what had been gained. Memory, as the narrator reveals, is not just about remembering the past, it is about shaping the future. What we choose to remember and what we choose to forget becomes the lens through which we view the world. And in the wake of the plague, humanity chose to remember not the devastation, but the resilience, the capacity to rebuild, the will to survive. The section shifts quietly as the narrator begins to transition to the next theme, the meaning of fear. Fear had shaped the actions of every civilization, but in the wake of the plague, it had taken on a new form. It had become not just an emotion, but a force of nature, one that would reshape the course of history in ways. Fear is a strange thing. It can break us, but it can also teach us. It is both a poison and a teacher, a force that can devastate, but also illuminate. The narrator's voice deepens as the story shifts to the complex relationship between humanity and fear. The plague had shown the world how fragile life truly was, but it had also shown the world how resilient humanity could be. Fear destroyed us and kept us alive, the narrator says, almost as a quiet revelation. Fear, in the wake of the plague, was no longer something to be avoided. It was something to be understood. It had guided human instinct for millennia, and it would continue to shape the world for centuries to come. But in the wake of the Black Death, fear began to change. It became a force of learning, of understanding. In the aftermath of the plague, people did not simply return to the old ways of living. They did not simply pick up where they had left off. They looked at the world differently, through eyes that had seen the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. Fear, once something to be feared, had become something to learn from. The narrator paints a quiet picture of scholars poring over ancient texts, of healers experimenting with new remedies, of philosophers quietly questioning the world around them. In the midst of destruction, the seeds of progress were planted. Science, once rejected by the religious authorities, began to take root in the wake of the plague. The study of anatomy, the understanding of disease, the practice of medicine, all these began to emerge not as a result of divine inspiration, but as a result of human fear and the desire to understand it. Fear had taught humanity its most difficult lesson, that life was precious, fragile, and fleeting. But it had also taught humanity its greatest strength, that the will to survive, to learn, and to grow was just as powerful. Fear had shaped the course of history, but it had also made humanity stronger, more determined, more creative. The section concludes with the narrator's voice softening, almost like a whisper. Fear, once the destroyer of all things, had become the creator of everything that followed. It had pushed humanity forward, made it question, made it innovate. And from that innovation, from that fear, the world would rise again. As the section fades, the narrator gently transitions to the final moments of the story, the return to the quiet village where it all began. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth continues, and with it, humanity's never-ending. Centuries have passed, and yet the village remains. In the quiet of the evening, the remnants of the once thriving settlement lie in stillness, as if waiting for something, perhaps for the past to return, or perhaps for the future to finally arrive. The wind carries the faint scent of earth and moss, the scent of time itself. In the distance, the stone ruins of what was once a chapel stand like the bones of an ancient creature, weathered by years of solitude but never truly forgotten. The narrator's voice is slower now, almost reverent. There is no rush, only the quiet passage of time. The fog rolls across the fields, veiling the outline of what remains, the crumbling well where the villagers once gathered, now filled with only dust, the jagged edges of homes long abandoned, their walls softened by the touch of the elements. The chapel, still standing, though its windows have long since shattered and its bells fallen silent. Every ruin, the narrator whispers, is a memory waiting to dream again. The scene shifts gently from the present to the past, weaving together time like a tapestry of moments. The village, once full of life, now only speaks through the remnants of what was. The stones, the earth, the broken windows, each of these holds a story. But what story is left to tell? And what is remembered in the silence between the present and the past? The camera moves slowly across the ruins, each frame like a meditation on impermanence. The beauty of decay is not in its destruction, but in its endurance. The village may be empty, its streets long silent, but its very existence, its survival through time, becomes its own story. The remnants of human life, now entwined with nature, continue to speak in ways words never could. This is the story of survival, not in the form of battle or conquest, but in the form of endurance. The village may have been ravaged by the plague, but it endured. The stones may have weathered, but they still stand. The people may have vanished, but the memory of their lives, their struggles, and their quiet victories remains in the very earth they walked upon. The narrator invites the audience to reflect on this impermanence. The village, now quiet, is not a place of death, but a place of memory. It is not the end of a story, but a continuation, one that lives on in the wind, in the fog, and in the stillness of the ruins. As the section closes, the narrator hints at what is to come. The story is not over yet. The ruins of the village, though they speak of death, also speak of life. And from this silence, something new will emerge. In the quiet of the evening, the truth becomes clear. The villagers did not outsmart the plague. They did not defeat death with knowledge, nor with science, nor with magic. They survived it not through brilliance, but through instinct. They survived because they had no choice, because survival is the most primal of human instincts. And in this survival, they learned something deeper, something that transcended reason. They didn't defeat death, the narrator says softly. They learned how to live beside it. The village that once stood at the edge of the known world, filled with fear and superstition, had learned the most basic of truths, that life, in all its fragility, is worth preserving. The survivors did not seek immortality. They did not try to escape death. They accepted it as part of their world, as something inevitable, and in doing so, they learned to live in spite of it. The village may have been filled with rituals, with prayers and offerings, with superstitions and fear, but at its heart, it was filled with something far stronger, the will to endure, the will to live, even when the odds were stacked against you. The villagers may not have understood the disease that took so many lives, but they understood what it meant to survive. As the narrator paints this image, the mood becomes quieter, more introspective. The villagers' survival was not a victory over death, but a quiet act of rebellion against it. They lived not by conquering death, but by acknowledging it and continuing to live in its shadow. The survival of the village was not a triumph of strength, but a triumph of resilience. The survivors, though they had lost so much, had gained something invaluable. The understanding that survival was not just about avoiding death, but about living fully in the presence of it. They did not defeat the plague. They learned to live beside it. They learned to find joy in the small things, the shared meal, the quiet moments of companionship, the passing of time. The narrator's voice takes on a gentle, almost meditative tone. The lesson here is simple. Survival is not just about what we do, but how we do it. It is not about outsmarting death, but about accepting it and continuing to move forward. The villagers may have been broken, but they were not defeated. They had learned to live beside death, and in doing so, they had learned to live fully. As this section draws to a close, the narrator begins to transition. The story is winding down, but one final question remains. What did the survivors take with them from the ashes? What wisdom did they carry into the future? And how will that wisdom shape As the night settles over the village, the air grows still, save for the whisper of the wind through the ruins. The stones that once made up the walls of homes now lie scattered, forgotten, but they still carry the echoes of those who lived there. The wind passes through the broken windows of the chapel, carrying with it fragments of songs that were once sung on long nights during the plague. The lullabies, now lost to time, seem to float in the air, lingering as whispers of a past that can never be fully erased. When the wind passes through the ruins, the narrator says softly, it still speaks if you listen. The village, now quiet, holds more than just memories. It holds the stories of those who lived, of those who struggled, of those who survived. The ruins are not just stones, they are the keepers of history, of the lives that once filled this place. The wind, though it cannot bring them back, carries their voices forward, reminding the living that the dead are never truly gone. The narrator reflects on this, slowly drawing the story to a close. The village, though silent, is not empty. The people may be gone, but their memory lingers in the very air. The lullabies, though no longer sung, are still felt. The lessons of the past, though forgotten by many, are still alive in the hearts of those who remember. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth continues. The plague may have taken its toll, but the village, though it sleeps, has not died. It lives on in memory, in the wind, in the stories told by those who remain. The survivors, though few, carry with them the wisdom of the past. The wisdom that death is not the end, but a part of the eternal cycle. As the narrator's voice grows softer, the tone becomes more reflective. The wind, though it passes through the ruins, does not speak of endings. It speaks of continuity. It speaks of the quiet resilience of humanity, of the ability to rebuild after every silence. The story ends not with finality, but with an invitation to listen. The wind carries with it the echoes of the past, but it also carries the promise of the future. The village sleeps, but it dreams. And as long as it dreams, the story will never truly end.